Deep in the Laotian darkness, a North Vietnamese convoy commander's voice cut through the silence, barking rapid orders. At his signal, 30 truck engines roared to life at once, lurching forward into the jungle. Then came a whine, distant at first, but then growing to a scream that drowned out everything below. One after the other, explosions erupted down the convoy line, each blast perfectly spaced, turning trucks into flames and precious southbound supplies into ashes. The shocked commander stared at his shattered group. How could they be found under the thick canopy in the middle of the night? He paces, almost stepping on a small, thin antenna, no bigger than a weed, poking through the dirt. And 200 miles away in Thailand, in a room that officially didn't exist, technicians watch green dots blinking on their wall-sized display of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The Americans had turned the jungle itself into a weapon. Beneath the dense canopy of the Annamite Mountains, the North Vietnamese Army built a logistics network unlike anything the United States Army had ever encountered. The Ho Chi Minh Trail, stretching for thousands of miles through Laos and Cambodia, was invisible from above. Beneath what looked like virgin jungle lay concealed truck depots, fuel dumps, and supply stations, serving one single purpose: keep the war in the South alive. In response, the Air Force launched Operations Barrel Roll and Rolling Thunder to interrupt the flow of supplies. By spring 1966, however, Rolling Thunder had devolved into a tightly controlled campaign where every target required White House approval, with critical infrastructure strikes repeatedly denied. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara was beginning to see the bombing campaign as futile. After months of missions with no impact on enemy supply lines, he knew something had to change. Even General William Westmoreland, commanding U.S. forces in Vietnam, recognized that conventional tactics weren't working against this ever-evolving enemy. McNamara found hope in the Jasons, a little-known group of elite physicists, engineers, and mathematicians from MIT, Harvard, and other top universities who'd advised the Pentagon on its most complex problems since 1959. Now, in the summer of 1966, they gathered once again to tackle Vietnam. Where generals saw failure, the Jasons saw opportunity. Their proposal to the Defense Secretary was radical: technology. This elite team proposed creating an electronic fence using sensors to detect enemy movement and sound. When triggered, they'd transmit to aircraft overhead, which would relay the data to computers that could pinpoint targets in real time. McNamara loved it. Without waiting for Joint Chiefs' approval, he created a secret task force in September 1966, appointing Lieutenant General Alfred Starbird to run the intentionally bland-named Defense Communications Planning Group. The money flowed immediately when the White House gave the project the highest national priority early the following year. The budget was so large, one insider joked that if they'd asked for 10,000 chocolate cream pies by noon, the Army would deliver without question. While the original plan called for both a physical barrier paired with a parallel electronic sensor network stretching through Laos, the Marines balked at the idea of building fences through the jungle and hills they knew couldn't be held. The terrain was too rough, and the manpower required was too great. While the idea of building physical obstacles was quietly abandoned, the electronic component survived, soon to be codenamed Igloo White. What started as an academic exercise by university scientists had evolved into one of the largest and most expensive military programs in American history. Operation Igloo White, America's high-tech surveillance campaign, was an interconnected network based on three primary components: sensors on the ground, military aircraft overhead to capture transmissions, and a massive processing facility at Nakhon Phanom Air Base in Thailand. At the heart of it all were the sensors. Developed by some of the top electronics firms in the U.S., the best engineers in the country pushed the boundaries of 1960s technology. Beyond making these devices tough enough to survive being dropped from aircraft, engineers faced another critical challenge: battery life. Early models relied on nickel-cadmium batteries that died after just 2 weeks. After experimenting with remote-controlled power systems to extend that limit, the real breakthrough came with lithium batteries, expanding operational life to nearly 2 months. These early and very costly models, with prices of up to $14,000 when adjusted for inflation, had poor performance. But over time, dozens of improved custom-designed sensors were rolling out of the factories and heading for Vietnam. Once in Asia, The models were released from F-4 Phantom fighters and CH-3 helicopters, then plummeted toward the canopy below, primed and ready to work. The air-delivered seismic intrusion detector became the workhorse of the operation. This 31-inch steel stake weighed 25 pounds and would strike the earth with enough force to bury itself completely, leaving only a small antenna, carefully disguised to look like local vegetation, poking through the dirt. The device was capable of sensing an enemy truck rumbling down a dirt road from hundreds of yards away. These ground vibrations would travel through the soil and up through the sensor's body, triggering transmissions to guide bombers to their targets. For detecting sound, engineers developed 2 acoustic sensors based on U.S. Navy sonobuoys. The massive spike buoy, 66 inches long and 40 pounds, also drove itself deep into the soil on impact, and also came with a smaller cousin, the 36-inch Aku buoy, which floated down on a parachute until it snagged in the trees, where it would hang for weeks, swaying in the wind, its tiny microphone recording every engine noise, every conversation, and every footstep that passed below. The most unique of its kind was one affectionately called the people sniffer, a chemical sensor that could detect ammonia from human sweat and urine as the smells carried on the jungle breeze. To help their acoustic sensors hear real movement in the jungle, war planners greenlit the drop of acoustic mines, devices that made a loud noise when somebody stepped on them. But according to rumors, it wasn't long before real mines were also being tossed out of planes as part of Operation Igloo White. As stated by Steve Lukasik, director of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or DARPA, during this period, quote, "They were devilish little mines. They were mines you stepped on, and they had this whole range of what we would now call cluster bombs. Except they weren't clustered bombs, they were cluster mines." At its peak, Operation Igloo White had more than 20,000 sensors of all kinds scattered across the Laotian jungle, the majority of which were dropped by U.S. Navy and Air Force aircraft. However, in areas too difficult or dangerous to reach by air, special operations units occasionally snuck into enemy territory to manually install them. The devices were typically deployed in groups of 5 or 6 to increase the odds that at least half would activate correctly and survive environmental impact. Meanwhile, these electronic devices were also on a continuous resupply cycle due to their batteries. Together, these devices formed a vast hidden mesh of electronic surveillance along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. But the system had its quirks. Weather, local wildlife, and even distant thunder could trigger false positives. Frogs, in particular, were a major nuisance, as their movements often produced seismic readings that mimicked enemy foot traffic. And with no long-range transmitters, the only way to pull data from the jungle was by air. After installation, orbiting aircraft like the EC-121R Batcat would fly the crucial relay missions, becoming the critical link in Operation Igloo White's surveillance chain, enabling real-time intelligence from the jungle floor to scientists. Each of these modified aircraft carried a crew of 17 to 18 personnel, including 6 or 7 technicians in the rear compartment managing the sensor monitoring equipment. The teams operated in grueling 8-hour rotations, though the total mission time, accounting for transit, briefing, and debriefing, often stretched well beyond 10 hours. Despite their effectiveness, when the EC-121Rs were expensive to operate and too risky to do day in and day out, these were eventually phased out in favor of the QU-22B Pay Beagle, crewed with only a pilot, the rest of the cabin space entirely filled with surveillance electronics. From there, this valuable data would be sent to the most state-of-the-art establishment in all of Asia, the Infiltration Surveillance Center. Located at Nakhon Phanom, a Thai Air Force base so close to Laos that workers could see the jungle across the river, the nerve center of Operation Igloo White, though officially designated by various names, including Dutch Mill and Operating Location Number 1, was most commonly known as Task Force Alpha. Rising out of the jungle in 1967, this command hub for electronic warfare efforts, spanning roughly 200,000 square feet, was reportedly the largest structure in Southeast Asia at the time. Such size was necessary, as the place was packed with some of the most advanced military computers and surveillance tech the Cold War had ever produced. According to Vietnam co-pilot Duke Wiley, quote, "Remember those huge electronic boards from the movie Dr. Strangelove that showed Russian bombers headed for the US? Well, Task Force Alpha is a lot like that. It's geek central." Inside the command room, the members of the task force tracked the jungle battlefield in real time, through row after row of glowing monitors, while massive electronic situation boards lined the walls, displaying giant, detailed maps with sensor hits, convoy movements, and strike data. But the pièce de résistance of the entire building was the site's 2 IBM 36065 mainframes, the most advanced computers available at the time. Every time a sensor was tripped, the computers lit up and pinpointed the exact location in real time. Then, it was up to the operators inside Task Force Alpha to interpret the data and decide whether they were seeing a supply convoy or a civilian. If the reading suggested a legitimate target, strike orders could follow within minutes. If not, the system stayed silent, or at least it was supposed to. Following a visit to the facilities, Senator Barry Goldwater declared the high-tech setup to be the future of war, stating, quote, "I personally think it has the possibility of being one of the greatest steps forward in warfare since gunpowder." The Defense Communications Planning Group, or DCPG, was the official name of the task force behind it all. This dull and bureaucratic name for one of the most secretive and technologically advanced military projects of the war was on purpose. If intercepted, it would sound like nothing more than a communications office. Because of the sensitive nature of the operation, security at Task Force Alpha was airtight. Access was tightly controlled, with clearance levels assigned room by room. Even the janitors were pulled from within the program and had to be experienced non-commissioned officers. By late 1967, Operation Igloo White was finally online. After months of field trials and technical hurdles, once activated, the grid transformed the jungle into a surveillance trap. Each night, the system came alive, connecting the jungle floor to orbiting planes and glowing war rooms deep in Thailand. As one Air Force officer put it, quote, "We wire the Ho Chi Minh Trail like a drugstore pinball machine. Before, the enemy had 2 things going for him. The sun went down every night, and he had trees to hide under. Now he has nothing." With the system live, the analysts in place, and the jungle already heating up, it wouldn't take long for Igloo White to be tested for real. By January 1968, Robert McNamara had stepped down as Secretary of Defense, and all that was left of his broader barrier concept was Igloo White, the part managed by the Air Force, the very branch that vehemently resisted the idea in the first place. That same month, 3 full divisions of North Vietnamese forces closed in on the remote U.S. Marine Combat Base at Ca San, located just a few miles from the Laotian border in western Quang Tri Province, thus beginning one of the most heavily scrutinized and high-stakes sieges of the war. With the base encircled and artillery fire intensifying, General William Westmoreland, head of all American forces in Vietnam, ordered Task Force Alpha to halt full-scale testing and to redirect all equipment originally intended for the dye marker barrier along the DMZ to support the defense of the Marine base. Beginning on January 22nd, aircraft from Navy Squadron VO-67 began deploying acoustic and seismic sensors across the approaches to Ca San, totaling 316 devices and placed in 44 separate strings that formed some sort of electronic perimeter, completely invisible to the enemy. While the Marine air controllers were skeptical at first, believing the idea of relying on buried electronics instead of patrols and scouts to be a potentially costly gamble, the tiny machines began to deliver accurate, timely, and essential data. Before long, Operation Igloo White was credited with producing 40% of all actionable intelligence used by the Ca San Fire Coordination Center. One night, during the siege of Ca San, movement triggered a set of buried sensors near one of the outlying hill positions. The data flowed back through the Igloo White network, alerting the Marine Fire Coordination Center. Within moments, artillery was already on the way. The rounds struck hard and fast, scattering the attackers before they reached the perimeter. But not all of the enemy had stayed on that approach. The second group had broken off before the sensors were triggered and came in from another angle, one that wasn't covered by electronics. That fight, by contrast, became a brutal close-range struggle that only ended after intense resistance from the defenders. The difference was impossible to ignore. Colonel David E. Lowndes, the Marine commander at Ca San, praised the sensors, stating his belief that the devices did the work of manned outposts, saving countless soldiers' lives through their expendability. Meanwhile, for Westmoreland, a man who had supported the electronic barrier concept from the very beginning, the success at one of the most critical battles of the Vietnam War proved Igloo White's validity at last. After the final air operations near Khasan, all the attention shifted back to the dense jungle corridors of Laos. By the fall, the Air Force launched a sweeping new effort, Operation Commando Hunt, a campaign that would eventually become the longest-running and most intensive air interdiction program of the entire war. With the operations working together, for the first time, the bombing war in Laos was being guided almost entirely by remote sensors and algorithmic targeting. For this purpose, there was a wide range of aircraft working non-stop, including heavy B-52s dropping tons of ordnance over broad swaths, while B-57s and Navy strike fighters zeroed in on tighter sections. However, the most effective platform for engaging truck convoys was the AC-130 gunship. Equipped with an array of advanced sensors like low-light television systems, forward-looking infrared, and the highly sensitive Black Crow detector that could pick up engine emissions from miles away. While this aircraft often worked independently, its crews frequently integrated data provided by Task Force Alpha to amplify the effectiveness. However, the bombings weren't usually as precise. According to a Pentagon news briefing from February 1971, Brigadier General William G. Evans, Air Force Special Assistant for Sensor Exploitation, explained, quote, "We're not bombing a precise point on the ground with a point target bomb. Since we never actually see the trucks as point targets, we use area-type ordnance to cover the zone we know the trucks to be in. We have an interdiction system which can hurt the enemy, even when he seeks the cover of foliage, weather, or darkness." While the sensor's greatest protection came from nature itself, as the thick jungle canopy made the devices nearly impossible to spot from ground level, it wasn't long before the North Vietnamese adapted to these small yet mighty threats. Once the enemy forces suspected a sensor's location, they methodically hunted for others nearby, destroying everything in their path or simply changing their routes to bypass the tiny devices. Eventually, the enemy developed much more sophisticated countermeasures, like fooling the sensors with false signals and decoy movements, and even hanging buckets of urine in trees as an attempt to foil the chemical devices. On the other hand, Operation Igloo White hadn't taken into account one significant limitation. Even at the bombing campaign's peak, up to 2 miles of new routes were being built across the Ho Chi Minh Trail almost every day. In March 1970, when President Richard Nixon publicly confirmed U.S. military operations in Laos, as more information surfaced, the Igloo White program began facing increased scrutiny. And while the broader American strategy aimed to drain North Vietnam's resources and force a negotiated end to the war, it had the opposite effect. Rather than backing down, Hanoi doubled down. In 1972, it launched its largest offensive of the entire conflict, the Whine Offensive, a full-scale invasion across the DMZ with tanks and infantry, catching U.S. forces by surprise. And Igloo White, despite years and millions of dollars in investment, failed to detect the buildup. In response to the offensive, the U.S. shifted course. Operations Linebacker 1 and 2 redirected American air power away from Laos and toward the north. And now, with bombing no longer tied to the trail and fewer resources committed to the sensor network, Igloo White began to fade from the center of the war effort. By the end of the year, the program was effectively winding down, and Task Force Alpha, the once buzzing Infiltration Surveillance Center, began shutting its doors. The vast databanks of the IBM mainframe were dismantled, packed into shipping containers, and flown out. Now, all that remained from the high-security operations center was a skeleton crew boxing up consoles, wire bundles, and reams of magnetic tape. The financials of this massive operation proved staggering. Igloo White alone consumed nearly $1 billion per year, not including the air crews, aircraft, and support infrastructure required to keep it running. Bombing missions guided by its sensor data added another $18.2 million every week. These figures didn't account for the aircraft lost over Laos or the crews who never came back. Because of this, the assessment of its success remains split to this day. Some incidents bordered on the unbelievable. In one case, a sensor-guided strike hit what was likely an ammunition or fuel depot, with the resulting blast causing a mushroom cloud soaring 8,000 feet into the air, visible from miles away. The 7th Air Force claimed that during the 1968-69 dry season alone, no less than 6,000 trucks were either destroyed or damaged. That number jumped to 10,000 the following year, and by 1970-71, they reported 20,000 trucks taken out. These figures came during the dry season, and traffic on the trail peaked between November and May, before slowing in the monsoon months. What the official numbers didn't clarify, however, was how many of those strikes were actually guided by Igloo White's sensors, and not everyone trusted the statistics. In 1971, the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee expressed skepticism, noting that many U.S. officials, including Air Force personnel, routinely applied a 30% discount to reported figures. At one point, the annual tally of trucks reportedly struck was higher than the total number of vehicles estimated to exist in all of North Vietnam. The CIA's mathematics, however, automatically discounted 75% of the truck kills reported by pilots. While both sides have their flaws, one thing is true. In the quest to electronically seal off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the U.S. military pioneered a suite of technologies that would outlive the Vietnam War and quietly reshape domestic security. According to a 1969 speech by General William Westmoreland, quote, "On the battlefield of the future, enemy forces will be located, tracked, and targeted almost instantaneously through the use of data links, computer-assisted intelligence evaluation, and automated fire control." By the early 1970s, those same sensor systems were being adapted for use along the U.S.-Mexico border. Originally designed to detect enemy movement, they were now used to monitor smugglers, drug traffickers, and unauthorized crossings. As one of the earliest smart battlefield systems, decades before the 2020s AI craze, Igloo White integrated sensor data, recognized patterns, and predicted enemy movement with an unprecedented level of automation.